Ladies and gentlemen, if you enjoy my video, please click the like button and share the video. It is the only way the YouTube algorithms really notices me. I will be very grateful to you. The shadows under my bed aren't just shadows. Scary story published by Scare Fiction. Read for you by Scare Fiction. Chapter 1. The Unseen Terror. Sarah pulled the last box out of the trunk, her muscles aching from the day's labor. She surveyed the old, weathered house, its chipped paint and sagging roof, a far cry from the home she'd imagined when she decided to move. But it was all she could afford after the divorce, and in a small Midwestern town like this, it was the best she could do for her son, Ethan. Ethan stood beside her, clutching his worn teddy bear. His wide, curious eyes roamed the house, but he stayed close to Sarah, as if sensing the change in their lives. "Mommy, why does the house make that noise?" he asked, his voice a whisper. Sarah followed his gaze to the front door, where the wind had forced a low, eerie creak from the old hinges. She forced a smile, determined to make this work for both of them. "It's just an old house, sweetie. It has a lot of stories to tell." But as they stepped inside, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the house had more secrets than stories. The air was colder than it should have been, for early autumn, and shadows clung to the corners of the rooms, as though reluctant to leave. She flipped the light switch, and the bulb flickered before casting a dim, yellow glow across the room. Ethan ran ahead, his small footsteps echoing through the empty space. "This can be your room," Sarah called after him, pointing to a room at the end of the hallway. It was the smallest in the house, but it had a window overlooking the backyard, a place she hoped would be a sanctuary for him. But when Sarah entered the room, Ethan wasn't at the window like she'd expected. Instead, he stood by the bed, staring at the floor with wide, frightened eyes. "Mommy, there's something under there," he whispered, his voice trembling. Sarah knelt beside him, forcing a laugh. "It's probably just dust bunnies, Ethan. Nothing to worry about." She lifted the edge of the blanket and peered under the bed. There was nothing there but darkness. Ethan didn't seem convinced. He climbed into the bed reluctantly, his eyes never leaving the shadows beneath it. Sarah kissed his forehead, promising herself that everything would be fine once they settled in. But as she walked down the hall, the house seemed to groan, and a cold draft whispered against her skin. She glanced back at Ethan's room, the shadows deepening in the fading light. It was just the house settling, she told herself. Just an old, creaky house. Yet, when she returned to unpacking, the feeling of being watched lingered, as if the house was waiting, its shadows biding their time. Chapter 2. Unsettling Discoveries. Sarah lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, but it was the silence inside that unnerved her. She had tried to convince herself that the strange feeling earlier was just nerves from the move, but sleep was elusive. Every creak and groan of the old house seemed amplified in the quiet of the night. Then, a scream pierced the darkness. Sarah bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Ethan." She stumbled out of bed and rushed down the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold wooden floor. When she reached his room, she found him sitting up in bed, his small body trembling, his face pale with terror. "Mommy, it's under the bed. It's going to get me," Ethan sobbed, clutching his blanket as if it were a shield. Sarah gathered him into her arms, trying to soothe his fear. "Shh, it's okay, Ethan. It's just a bad dream." But even as she said the words, a chill ran down her spine. She glanced at the dark space under the bed, half expecting to see something lurking there, something that shouldn't be. But there was nothing, just darkness. Ethan refused to go back to sleep in his room, so Sarah let him sleep in her bed. She held him close, trying to calm him, but his fear was infectious, and soon she found herself lying awake, her eyes darting to the shadows in the corners of the room. The next morning, Sarah noticed something she hadn't seen before. Small, purple bruises on Ethan's arms. She gently traced them with her fingers, her stomach twisting with concern. "Ethan, how did you get these?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Ethan looked down at the bruises and then up at her, his eyes wide. "I don't know, Mommy. I just woke up and they were there." Sarah's worry deepened, but she didn't want to frighten him more. "Maybe you bumped into something. Just be careful, okay?" But as the days passed, the strange occurrences in the house escalated. Objects weren't where Sarah had left them. Doors that she knew she had closed would creak open on their own, and the cold drafts seemed to grow more frequent and biting. She started to hear faint whispers in the night, soft voices that she couldn't quite make out, like someone speaking just out of earshot. And the shadows under Ethan's bed, they seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if they were becoming more solid, more real. One afternoon, as Sarah was struggling with a stubborn door that refused to stay closed, she heard a voice from behind her. That door never did like to stay shut. Startled, Sarah turned to see an elderly woman standing at the gate. Her silver hair was pulled back into a neat bun, and she wore a faded floral dress that looked like it had seen better days. There was something in the woman's eyes, a knowing look that made Sarah uneasy. "I'm Mrs. Harper," the woman introduced herself with a thin smile. "I live next door. Thought I'd come by and welcome you." Sarah forced a smile, grateful for the company. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. I'm Sarah, and this is Ethan." She gestured toward her son, who was playing quietly on the porch. Mrs. Harper's gaze shifted to Ethan, then to the house, her expression growing somber. "You be careful in that house, dear. It's got a history, you know. Families don't stay long. Always something that drives them away." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, a knot forming in her stomach. Mrs. Harper's eyes narrowed as she looked at the house. "Just don't go poking around where you shouldn't. Especially at night. Some things in that house are best left alone." As Mrs. Harper turned to leave, Sarah felt a chill settle over her. The warning hung in the air like a dark cloud, and the unease that had been growing inside her deepened. The shadows under Ethan's bed were not just shadows. Something was very wrong in this house, and Sarah was beginning to fear it was only the beginning. Chapter 3. The Haunting Intensifies. The warning from Mrs. Harper lingered in Sarah's mind like a dark fog that she couldn't shake. She tried to focus on normalcy, getting Ethan ready for school, unpacking the rest of their things, and making this old house feel like a home. But it was becoming harder to ignore the sense that something was terribly wrong. It started with Ethan's conversations. Late one night, Sarah was jolted awake by the sound of Ethan's voice, soft and muffled, coming from his room. Her heart raced as she slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the hall. She pushed open the door to his room, finding him sitting up in bed, his eyes fixed on the darkness beneath it. "Ethan, who are you talking to?" she whispered, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes wide and innocent. "The boy under my bed, Mommy. He says he's lonely." Sarah felt a chill crawl up her spine. She flicked on the light, banishing the shadows to the corners of the room. "There's no one there, sweetie. It's just your imagination." Ethan didn't argue, but his gaze remained fixed on the floor, as though he could still see something she couldn't. Sarah tucked him back into bed, her hands trembling, and hurried out of the room, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist as she left. The following days only intensified her growing fear. The shadows no longer waited for the night. Sarah began to see them, shifting in the daylight, a flicker in the corner of her eye, a dark shape that vanished when she turned to look. She caught herself holding her breath, listening for whispers that seemed just out of reach. Ethan's condition grew worse with each passing day. He no longer laughed or played like he used to. Instead, he spent hours hunched over his sketchbook, furiously drawing the same thing over and over: shadows, dark and formless, with eyes that seemed to watch her from the pages. "Mommy, I don't want to sleep in my room anymore," Ethan said one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. His once bright face was now pale, with dark circles under his eyes. He had lost weight, his small frame looking even more fragile. Sarah couldn't bear to see him like this. "Okay, Ethan, you can sleep in my room until we figure this out." But she knew deep down that this was beyond her control. The house had a grip on Ethan, and it was tightening. Desperate for answers, Sarah began to dig into the house's history. Late one night, after Ethan had finally fallen asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, scrolling through old newspaper archives and town records. What she found made her blood run cold. The house had once belonged to a man named William Blackwood, a reclusive figure who had been notorious in the town for practicing dark rituals in the basement. Rumors swirled that he had dabbled in the occult, attempting to summon spirits or worse. The details were murky, but one thing was clear: every family that had lived in the house since had either fled in terror or disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Sarah stared at the screen, the reality of their situation sinking in. This wasn't just a haunted house. It was a place steeped in darkness, cursed by whatever evil Blackwood had unleashed. As she closed the laptop, the kitchen light flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The shadows seemed to pulse, inching closer as the light dimmed. It was no longer just Ethan's imagination. The haunting was real, and Sarah could feel the malevolent presence closing in around them. Chapter 4: Descent into Madness. The darkness had become a constant companion, following Sarah everywhere she went. She couldn't escape it, not at home, not at work, not even in the daylight. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own, moving in the corners of her vision, slipping just out of sight whenever she tried to focus on them. Her nights were filled with nightmares, twisted dreams where she was endlessly pursued by shadowy figures with hollow, staring eyes. Sarah would wake up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding, only to find herself still surrounded by darkness. The once comforting warmth of her bed had turned into a prison, the shadows creeping up the walls, pooling at the edges of the room, like ink spreading across paper. Each night, the nightmares grew worse, more vivid, until she couldn't tell where the dreams ended and reality began. At first, she tried to ignore the shadows, to convince herself that it was all in her head. But as the days wore on, the shadows began to spread, moving beyond Ethan's room. They slithered through the hallways, lingered in the kitchen, and even followed her to work. She'd catch glimpses of them in the reflection of her computer screen, lurking just behind her, waiting. At night, they seemed to whisper in her ears, taunting her, driving her to the brink of madness. Ethan's behavior grew more disturbing by the day. His once bright eyes were now dull and lifeless, and he rarely spoke except in strange, hushed tones. When he did talk, it was often in a voice that wasn't his own, a low, guttural sound that made Sarah's blood run cold. He spent hours staring at the shadows, as if they were speaking to him, guiding him. Sometimes, she would find him standing in the dark, his eyes fixed on something she couldn't see, his lips moving in silent conversation with the empty air. The tension at home began to seep into every aspect of Sarah's life. She started avoiding friends and coworkers, afraid they'd see the fear etched on her face, the madness creeping into her eyes. When her best friend, Jessica, called to check on her, Sarah snapped, accusing her of knowing more about the house than she let on. The rift between them grew, and soon, Sarah found herself completely isolated. alone with her growing terror. One night, as she sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall, a chilling scream shattered the silence. It was Ethan. She raced down the hallway, her heart hammering in her chest. When she reached his room, the sight before her was something out of her darkest nightmares. The shadows had come alive, writhing and twisting like a nest of serpents, coiling around Ethan's small frame. He thrashed and screamed, his face contorted in terror as the shadows seemed to pull at him, dragging him into their inky depths. Sarah lunged forward, desperate to save him, but when she reached out, her hands passed through the shadows as if they weren't even there. She screamed his name, her voice hoarse with panic, but the shadows only tightened their grip, Ethan's cries fading into a gurgled choke. She fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, powerless to stop the horror unfolding before her. And then, as suddenly as it began, the shadows released him, slinking back into the corners of the room. Ethan collapsed onto the bed, gasping for air, his body trembling. Sarah crawled to his side, gathering him into her arms, her heart breaking as he sobbed against her chest. It was real. The shadows were real, and they were coming for her son. Chapter 5. Seeking Help. Sarah's hands shook as she held Ethan close, her mind racing with fear and desperation. The shadows were no longer just a figment of imagination or a child's nightmare. They were real, and they were coming for her son. She needed help, and she needed it fast. The first person who came to mind was Mrs. Harper. The elderly woman had hinted at dark secrets in the house, secrets that Sarah had dismissed at first, but could no longer ignore. After making sure Ethan was resting, she hurried across the street to Mrs. Harper's house, her heart pounding in her chest. Mrs. Harper answered the door almost immediately, as if she had been expecting Sarah. Her expression softened with understanding when she saw the terror in Sarah's eyes. "Come in, dear," she said gently, ushering Sarah inside. "I need your help," Sarah blurted out, her voice trembling. "The shadows, they're attacking Ethan. I don't know what to do. Please, Mrs. Harper, you have to help us." Mrs. Harper led Sarah to the sitting room, where the air was thick with the scent of lavender and old wood. She gestured for Sarah to sit down and took a seat across from her, her eyes filled with concern. "You're not the first to experience this, Sarah," Mrs. Harper began, her voice heavy with the weight of the past. "This house, it has a dark history. The previous owners dabbled in things they shouldn't have, things that opened a door to something evil." Sarah swallowed hard, fear tightening her chest. "What kind of things?" "Occult practices," Mrs. Harper replied, her tone grave. "They tried to summon and control a malevolent force, but they didn't know what they were dealing with. Whatever they summoned is still in that house, and it's grown stronger over the years." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. "What can I do?" "I can't lose Ethan." Mrs. Harper reached out and took Sarah's hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "There's someone who might be able to help. Father Michael. He's dealt with cases like this before. I'll contact him." That evening, Mrs. Harper brought Father Michael to Sarah's home. He was a tall, stern-looking man with kind eyes that hinted at the burden of the things he had seen. Skeptical at first, Father Michael's doubts vanished when he stepped inside and felt the oppressive weight of the house. The shadows moved in the corners of the room, shifting as if aware of his presence. "This isn't just a haunting," Father Michael murmured, his voice low. "This is something much darker." Sarah, Mrs. Harper, and Father Michael began a thorough investigation of the house. They started in the basement, where the air was damp and heavy, the walls lined with old, crumbling brick. It didn't take long for them to uncover hidden symbols, carved into the floor and walls, symbols that Father Michael recognized from ancient texts. "These are binding symbols," he explained, tracing one with his finger. "The original owner of this house tried to bind the shadows to this place, to control them. But something went wrong. They discovered old, dusty tomes, tucked away in a corner, their pages yellowed and brittle. The books were filled with rituals and incantations, and it became clear that the original owner had been experimenting with forces far beyond his control. Father Michael's face grew pale as he read the final passages in one of the tomes. The ritual wasn't completed. The shadows were never fully bound. That's why they're still here, and why they're growing stronger. Sarah felt a cold dread settle over her. What can we do? Father Michael looked at her, his expression grave. We have to complete the ritual, but it won't be easy. The shadows are powerful, and they won't go down without a fight. We need to act quickly before they consume Ethan and you. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Sarah knew that the battle for her son's life had only just begun, and the shadows were far from finished with them. Chapter 6. Confronting the Darkness. The weight of what they were about to do settled heavily over the house, thickening the air with dread. Sarah, Father Michael, and Mrs. Harper moved through the rooms with quiet determination, gathering the materials needed to complete the ritual. Each step was a reminder of the stakes Ethan's life hung in the balance, and failure was not an option. The shadows, sensing the impending threat, grew bolder, more aggressive. The temperature in the house plummeted, and the walls seemed to close in on them. As they set up the ritual space in the basement, the shadows lashed out, no longer content to linger in the corners. They slithered across the floor, twisting and writhing, reaching out with dark tendrils that brushed against Sarah's skin like cold, wet fingers. Father Michael began to draw the protective symbols on the floor, his voice steady as he recited the ancient incantations. Mrs. Harper placed candles in a precise circle, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. Sarah, clutching a worn book of rituals, tried to steady her shaking hands. The pressure in the room grew, a tangible force pressing down on them, as if the house itself were alive, trying to crush their spirits. As Sarah lit the final candle, the shadows struck with full force. They swirled around her, cutting her off from the others. Panic clawed at her chest as the darkness closed in, pressing against her mind, distorting reality. The basement around her faded, replaced by a scene from her past, a memory she had buried deep, one she had hoped to forget. She was back in her old home, the one she shared with her ex-husband. The night of their worst fight replayed before her eyes. She heard the harsh words, the accusations, and the slamming of doors. The guilt she had tried to suppress all these years surged up, raw and painful. The shadows twisted the memory, making her relive the moments of her failed marriage, each word and action magnified, designed to break her. But it wasn't just the failed marriage. The shadows dragged her through every regret, every moment of weakness. She saw Ethan as a baby, crying in his crib while she stood outside the door, too exhausted and broken to comfort him. The shadows whispered in her ear, telling her she was a failure, that she didn't deserve to be a mother. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as the shadows tightened their grip on her mind, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. She could feel herself slipping, her resolve crumbling under the weight of her fears and regrets. But then, through the darkness, she heard Ethan's voice, faint but unmistakable. "Mommy, help me." The sound of his voice cut through the shadows like a blade. Sarah's heart swelled with a fierce, protective love. The shadows had tried to break her by preying on her deepest fears, but they had underestimated her love for her son. She wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for Ethan, and she would not let the shadows take him. Drawing on a strength she didn't know she had, Sarah forced herself to face the memories. to acknowledge the pain and guilt without letting it consume her. The shadows twisted and contorted, but she stood firm, her resolve hardening with each passing moment. "I am not my past," Sarah whispered, her voice steady and clear. "I am Ethan's mother, and I will not let you take him." With that declaration, the shadows recoiled, hissing and retreating as Sarah's strength pushed them back. The basement reappeared around her, the protective circle glowing with an otherworldly light. Father Michael's voice rose in the final incantation, and the shadows writhed in agony, unable to withstand the combined force of their resolve. Sarah stepped forward, joining Father Michael and Mrs. Harper in the circle. Together, they completed the ritual, the room filled with a blinding light as the shadows screamed and dissolved into nothingness. As the light faded, the oppressive weight lifted, leaving the basement still and silent. Sarah collapsed to her knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but the terror was gone. The shadows had been banished, and for the first time in weeks, the house was truly still. She had faced the darkness, both within and without, and emerged stronger. But she knew the fight wasn't over yet. The final confrontation was still to come. Chapter 7. The Final Battle. The basement was a battleground of light and darkness. The circle of candles cast flickering shadows against the walls as Sarah, Father Michael, and Mrs. Harper prepared for the climactic ritual. The air was thick with tension, and the oppressive weight that had plagued them for weeks seemed to coalesce into a palpable force. The house itself seemed to groan and shudder as if it were alive, fighting against the final assault. Father Michael chanted the ancient incantations with fierce determination, his voice echoing through the basement. Mrs. Harper worked alongside him, her hands steady as she manipulated the ritual components. Sarah, clutching the ritual book tightly, followed their lead, her heart pounding in her chest. The shadows, once mere hints of fear, now roiled and writhed with an almost sentient malice, stretching and twisting in grotesque forms. The shadows surged forward, attacking with a terrifying ferocity. They twisted into monstrous shapes, ghastly faces with hollow eyes, clawing hands reaching out from the darkness. The basement filled with guttural growls and the sound of scraping, like nails on a chalkboard. Sarah felt a cold grip around her heart as the shadows began to lash out, their attacks more physical and relentless. Father Michael was the first to fall. A shadowy tendril whipped out, catching him across the chest and sending him sprawling to the ground, his incantations faltering. Mrs. Harper rushed to his side, but she too was caught by a sudden onslaught of shadows, her screams echoing through the basement as she was thrown against the wall, injured and dazed. Sarah was left alone, the ritual nearly complete but with her allies incapacitated. The shadows, sensing their advantage, converged on her, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Sacrifice yourself, and we will spare him," they hissed, their voices a chilling chorus of deceit. "Let him be free of this torment, or join him in eternal darkness." The stakes had never been higher. The house seemed to tear apart around her, the walls shaking, the lights flickering wildly. Sarah glanced at Ethan, who lay on the floor, his small body trembling but still alive. Her heart ached with the weight of the choice before her. She could see the desperation in Ethan's eyes, hear the faint cries of her own guilt and fear echoing in the shadows. In a moment of raw, unflinching bravery, Sarah made her choice. She stepped into the center of the ritual circle, her resolve hardening. "I'll do it," she declared, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her insides. "Take me." The shadows converged on her, swirling around her form with a deafening roar. As they closed in, Sarah's thoughts were consumed by the love she felt for her son and the determination to protect him at any cost. She felt herself being pulled into the void, the darkness enveloping her, but she didn't waver. It was then, as Sarah offered herself to the shadows, that something remarkable happened. The shadows, now exposed to the light of her sacrifice, began to recoil, their forms twisting and breaking apart. In the blinding light of her selflessness, the true nature of the shadows was revealed, an amalgamation of Sarah's deepest fears and repressed traumas, made manifest and given power by her own inner darkness. The final incantation was completed as Sarah, despite being engulfed by the shadows, channeled her love and strength into the ritual. The shadows screamed in agony as they were banished, their dark forms dissipating into nothingness. The basement returned to eerie silence, the oppressive weight lifting from the house. Sarah collapsed, exhausted but victorious. As the shadows disappeared, the house seemed to exhale, the darkness finally lifting. She had saved Ethan, and though the battle was won, the scars of the ordeal would remain. But for now, the house was quiet, and the shadows were gone. Chapter 8: Aftermath and Reflection. The basement was still, the echoes of the final confrontation lingering in the cold air. The oppressive darkness had dissipated, leaving the house to breathe again. Sarah, her body trembling with exhaustion, looked around the now quiet room. Father Michael and Mrs. Harper, though injured, were recovering and had been able to leave, leaving Sarah alone with Ethan. She slowly climbed the stairs to Ethan's room. The house, while still old and creaky, no longer seemed to groan under the weight of malevolence. It was a different place now, haunted by its past, but free from the shadows that had plagued them. Sarah found Ethan asleep in his bed, his once pale face now flushed with a healthy color. His breathing was steady and peaceful, a stark contrast to the fear-filled nights they had endured. Sarah sank into a chair beside his bed, tears of relief mingling with fatigue. The ordeal had left its mark on her, but Ethan's recovery was a balm for her wounded soul. She reached out, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead, her heart swelling with love and gratitude. Despite the house's age and creaks, it felt like home in a way it hadn't before. They had survived the darkness, and that was a victory she clung to. As the days passed, Ethan's health improved dramatically. He smiled more, played with his toys, and even started to draw again, his sketches no longer filled with shadows, but with vibrant scenes of the world outside. Sarah watched him with a mix of joy and lingering unease. The shadows had been banished, but the fear and trauma of their ordeal had left deep scars. Sarah herself had changed. The darkness that had once lurked within her now seemed less daunting. She had faced her deepest fears, confronted her repressed traumas, and emerged stronger. Her acceptance of her past allowed her to focus on building a better life for Ethan. She made plans for their future, determined to create a stable, loving environment for her son. The house, though still old and creaky, was now a place of renewal. It felt different, lighter. Yet, as Sarah tucked Ethan into bed one night, a lingering unease gnawed at her. The shadows had been driven away, but a chill seemed to hover in the air, a subtle reminder of what they had faced. As she turned off the light and leaned in to kiss Ethan goodnight, her eyes were drawn to the space under the bed. For a fleeting moment, she thought she saw a faint, almost imperceptible shadow moving there. Her breath caught in her throat, and she quickly looked away, shaking off the feeling. She tucked the blanket around Ethan more tightly, trying to push the unsettling thought from her mind. As she closed the door to his room, she glanced back once more. The house was still, and the shadows had receded, but a small, disquieting thought lingered, one that whispered of a darkness that might never truly be gone. The house was quiet, its silence a fragile peace. Sarah knew that the shadows might have been banished, but their memory would linger, a haunting reminder of the battle they had fought and survived. The shadows under the bed might have been gone, but the echo of their presence was a chilling reminder that some fears never fully disappear.